this so that it's available to everyone on our YouTube website if you're not able to make these V3 implementation calls. Today is September 11th. Thank you for being on this morning for the V3 implementation call.
Yep, I'm on it right now.
Oh, good. And if you would remember to mute your phone when you're ready to talk, be sure and unmute so that we can get to your questions. Please feel free to ask questions as we go along. Use the chat box. We'll watch that for questions as well. I know sometimes it's hard to get to your unmute as fast as you want to when you have a question pop in your mind. So let's go ahead and get started. This morning, we're going to discuss UUID. And I'm going to turn the presentation over to Clay, and he's going to introduce that for us this morning.
Great. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. We are beginning the process of working through 5 topic items that we had in-depth discussions about 3 weeks ago up in Deer Valley at the August V3 implementation meeting. And we are starting with UUID because, as folks know, we are closing the candidate release this month, and so Laurel is very busy making all changes that were kind of associated with the review period and working through those. We want to be able to finish those up this week so that we can get the other products that we would like to release all together next month done. So version 3.5 will be open and available. We're tackling UUID first because there is an issue here that relates directly to the schema, so a decision needs to be made before we can actually move forward and kind of finalize the XSDs. So we'll start with UUID. You'll notice in column A on your screen there, this is just a spreadsheet that we've been working with to ensure that we covered all the topics that were reported out in Deer Valley, any detail that was necessary and provided, and then what we could potentially provide as deliverables and actions, what those deliverables could look like. So that kind of describes to you the columns. Most of these issues relate to education or documentation of the use of UUID. We'll talk about most of those issues here at the end of the discussion and after the poll. The issue that's kind of on the plate right now is whether or not to keep a UUID in the demographic report section of the DEM file, or whether to add it to the header of that file. So that's going to be the main topic of discussion, and we're hoping to think about whether these changes ought to be made in kind of the broader understanding of the original use case for the UUID, that is to ensure that individual agencies can properly track and then report changes to vehicles, personnel, or other things for which a UUID is attached, but then also to kind of think about the broader issues as well, the ones that we're kind of struggling with. For example, what might be the best way to facilitate a process whereby if an EMS agency was to switch software, how could we ensure that there would be a smooth transition of the initial UUID? So some issues like that. Josh, you want to go ahead and open up with the presentation?
Okay, sounds good.
Let me see if I can
I'm just going to switch to screen sharing here.
Okay, there you go. You should be able to grab it now.
Great. Okay, is that working?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Josh. Want to pick up with the background that Clay provided and address this question that we have about UUIDs. First, I want to kind of set the purpose and scope of UUIDs. This is a reiteration, but want to make sure that we're really clear on this. So UUIDs are used to uniquely identify demographic data objects representing things within an agency, like their locations, their vehicles, their personnel, facilities, etc., and patient care reports within an agency over time. And the reason for this UUID approach, the reason that it was proposed was that prior to NEMSIS 3.5, it was difficult for receive and process systems to track changes within an agency over time when they got updated demographic data submissions. For example, it'd be difficult for a system to determine whether a vehicle in demographic submission is a new object or an update to an existing vehicle that had all of its data changed. So with UUIDs, objects within an agency can be reliably tracked over time by those receive and process systems, the state systems, even if everything in each of those objects is modified. So that was the original purpose of the business problem we're trying to solve with UUIDs. And so we scoped UUIDs this way in NEMSIS. Number one was that they'll be generated by collect data software. So there's no master data repository at the state or national level that's coordinating the issuance of UUIDs. It's generated by the local level software, and these objects are created to represent things at an agency. And with that, then it means that if an agency switches software, then the new software, unless it has the ability to import data from the old system, it's going to go ahead and generate new UUIDs for those same entities when the agency sets up that software. So if they switch from one vendor product to another, the new product, they're going to just type in their personnel again, or they might do kind of a bulk load from a spreadsheet or something. And it's possible that those personnel, those vehicles, et cetera, will just get all new UUIDs. And that agency then submits their next demographic data update to the state. The state system, it would appear to the state system that that agency had, essentially deleted all former objects and created all new objects within the agency. So another way of stating this is that the uniqueness aspect of a universally unique identifier is universal. So when a UUID is created, there will never be that same string, that same UUID ever created again in the future to identify anything. So it's universal in that aspect. But the identification aspect of a UUID within NEMSIS has been scoped to be within an agency software product combo, an agency using a particular software product. That's the extent of the scope for identifying an object using UUID. In other words, if we change the agency or software, the same real world thing may be identified by a different UUID. So that identification aspect is only guaranteed within the scope of that agency using that software product. So for example, the following would be out of scope. Identifying the same real life entity like a person or a vehicle across different agencies using different software products by using the same UUID. That would be out of scope. So if John Doe works for agency A and agency B, agency A and agency B use different software products. Each of those software products will generate a different UUID for John Doe. He does not have a universal identifier that actually identifies him across agencies. Each of the IDs assigned to him would be universally unique, but the identification aspect of that ID is only within his agency. So before we pose the kind of the decision that we're trying to make here today, I want to make sure that we're very clear on this intended business purpose and scope. So are there any questions about the business purpose or scope of UUIDs, or anything that we should discuss or clarify?
Josh, this is Ryan Mock. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I have a question. Understanding that UUIDs are for a specific entity inside of a specific software, would a UUID allow for the identification of a single entity to multiple states? So I operate an EMS service on the border
Oh,
of
okay.
Arkansas and let's say Michigan and Ohio, because I couldn't immediately think of a state that bordered Arkansas. I operate an EMS station on the border of Michigan and Ohio. I want to submit my Michigan runs to Michigan, my Ohio runs to Ohio. Does this UUID answer that case for me?
That would be within the agency. So I would think that the same vehicle, for example, well, let's use personnel. They're more likely to cross states. Maybe they'll have vehicles that only, well, yeah, vehicles too. Say there's a vehicle that the agency uses. They use it in both of their states. So they're going to list it in their demographic data. They're going to send that demographic data to each state. So that vehicle would have one UUID. And when they send it to Michigan or they send it to, you know, somewhere else, Wisconsin, I would assume that that both states are going to receive the same UUID for that vehicle.
Even though each state would receive their individualized required fields, because they may have different licensing, numbering systems, and other things, they would have a single UUID for that entity because it's from one software product going with one software product inside of one agency being sent to multiple locations.
Yeah, yeah, that's. I think that would be the correct way to interpret that.
Thank you.
Hey, Josh.
Yes.
This is Elizabeth. I just wanted to say, even if two agencies use the same software, I would expect for personnel to have two different UUIDs because they would be completely separate stacks.
Some software products may do it that way, like each agency would individually enter in a person on their personnel list, independent of the other agency, without the other agency's knowledge. So the system would just generate a UUID for each of those. There are some systems where there's some coordination that happens, where there's someone who manages it at a system level and says, yeah, we have this person and they work for two agencies within our system. We're going to set them up once and they'll have the same UUID in the two agencies. But from a NEMSIS standard perspective, the way we've scoped it is we would not guarantee that behavior, right? The behavior that we would guarantee is that the UUID would identify the person within an agency using a software product, that combination of agency and software product.
Okay.
Okay, other questions or comments regarding scope? All right, so here's what we're trying to figure out. In the candidate release of 3.5, we put UUIDs on all of these data elements. These are all group elements. In other words, they have children and they can occur more than once within their parent. So, for example, agency year group can occur multiple times within an agency, and it has a set of half a dozen data elements that are its children. We also added UUID to patient care report, and this would uniquely identify a patient care report, again, within an agency. Now, because the identifier is universally unique, in real life, it'll probably identify a patient care report universally. But the scope in NEMSIS is that it would identify it within an agency. Okay, here's our dilemma. In the candidate release, we added a UUID to demographic report. This is the data object that represents the agency itself, the agency as a whole. We did not add a UUID to the EMS dataset header, and that header, the purpose of that header is to identify an agency. It has state, agency ID, agency number, those three elements. Okay, so we had UUID on demographic report, but not on the EMS dataset header. And we think that we need to reconcile this by either removing it from demographic report or adding it to the EMS dataset header. So it's either used or not used in the same way in both data sets. So here's what we're looking at. If our scope is set to be within an agency using a software product, then the application of a UUID for the agency itself is ambiguous. In other words, the UUID uniquely identifies the agency within the agency. You know, do we really need to identify an object within itself? That's where it gets ambiguous, and the questions come up about how we would actually use this identifier. So here are some considerations. So here's the decision that we're going to vote on today after we go through some more discussion. Do we remove the agency UUID from the demographic report, or do we add it to the EMS dataset header? So it's in neither place, or it's in both places. I think those are, you know, unless we hear otherwise this morning, those are the two options that we think we need to consider. Okay, so some considerations, and this is where I would love to have vendors, especially of state-level systems, to speak to these questions. It'll really help us to understand which way we should go. Okay, so consideration number one, authentication and authorization in receiving systems, in state systems. So first of all, when a local system sends data to a state system, then the state system uses the web service user ID and password in the in the SOAP web service message to authenticate the client. User ID, password, we look them up, we find a match, they're authenticated. Second, the state system must authorize that client for the data that they're submitting. So it receives this demographic data submission, or it receives a patient care report data submission. And the authorization part of this is saying, does this client have permission to submit this record? And usually that permission is based on the agency that the software says that it's submitting a record for. So if software A has been authorized to submit data for agency A, and software B has been authorized to submit data for agency B, then when a state system receives data from from software A, it will authenticate the software using user ID and password, and then it needs to authorize that software client. And so if software A is trying to submit data for agency B, then the state system is going to reject that submission and say, sorry, you don't have permission to submit for agency B. Okay, so depending on how we identify the agency, that would influence you know, how the authorization happens. I believe that today state systems are inspecting the agency ID and agency number, the agency 01 and 02, within the demographic data or within the EMS dataset header. If we were to add an agency UUID, then what would a state system use to identify the agency that the software is submitting for? What would the state system use to authorize that client? Would they rely on the UUID now? Or would they still use the combination of agency ID and agency number? And keep in mind that the UUID could change if the agency changes software. But we also know that the agency ID and agency number could change if the state makes a change to their licensing setup. So state level systems, have you given this some thought, how you would authorize clients, whether you would rely on the UUID for the agency or rely on the agency ID and agency number? What are your thoughts on this?
Hey Josh, this is Dan.
Yeah.
So we have not given this much thought since you just presented it to us. I guess for a small clarification, we also use the agency 04, so ID number and state.
Okay.
Currently. I guess maybe one of our concerns just off the top of our head is if we do use UUID for matching, does that mean that software companies are going to have to start exposing this field to potentially be modified on the fly on one end or the other so they can match up? And does that go against our definition of these kind of being in the background.
Yeah, great thought. Great. Other state?
Yeah, I'm just thinking out loud. So we don't have, I guess, a huge preference until maybe we think a little bit more about it.
Yeah, okay. Other state level software representatives? And of course, if you represent local level software, you're welcome to chime in as well. Okay, let's dig in a little with how changes would be handled. So let's say a system at the state level receives a demographic data set or EMS data set submission, and the agency UUID matches an existing agency record in that state system. However, the agency ID and agency number, and as Dan pointed out, the state, those three, that combination of elements are different than what is stored in the agency record. Okay, so let's say the agency UUID matches, but the agency ID and agency number are both 101 in the submitted data. But in the state system, the system looks, it finds the UUID, it finds the agency record that this is supposed to be for. But in the state system, agency ID and agency number are both 808. How would the state system respond? Would it say, okay, I found a match on the agency UUID, so I'm going to go ahead and update the agency ID and agency number. I'm going to not update those elements, but just ignore them, but I'll go ahead and process the rest of the data. Or would I reject the data because I didn't have a match on everything?
So Josh, this is Ryan again. And I could be wrong about this, but I think the point of the UUID would be to, for lack of a better word, unlock all the rest of the fields for editing, so that if an agency ID or an agency number came in different, the first ones were typos, or the first one, the state's released a new numbering system, but that UUID is there, so that validates the correctness of all the subsequent data fields. That's why you have a UUID, is so that you can open everything else up to change, because as long as you show up to me with the right unique identifier, I believe that you are changing all the other fields and are authorized to do so.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Hey, Josh, so what do you know, or anybody else on the call, does the NEMSIS TAC have a direction that they're going to match in 3.5? Or is that part of this discussion?
Yeah, that's why this is up for discussion. Is
okay.
We were looking at how that matching is going to happen, and went, what do we do here?
I will say, to Ryan's point, we've seen a fair number of issues this year where a state starts changing agency numbers, and it just completely, immediately invalidates all future posts. So using the UUID as the primary match would potentially, I guess, solve that problem, where it would allow agency numbers to change without breaking everything.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, so let's look at the third of the three considerations here, which is the opposite scenario. If a state system receives DEM or EMS dataset submission, and the agency and ID and number match an existing record in the state system, but the UUID is different. So the agency 101, they switched software vendors. Their new software product goes ahead and generates its first demographic data submission, or its first PCR. And so it submits that data. The agency ID and agency number are both 101. That's great, but it's a UUID that the state system hasn't seen before. So the state system has no existing record with that UUID, no existing agency with that UUID, but it does find an agency with the agency ID and agency number that are 101. How would the state system respond to that sort of submission? So, you know, go ahead.
Josh, sorry, it took me a second to hit the mute button. This would be the exact scenario when an agency changes vendors.
Right.
So now I'm using a new software product, and the new software product couldn't import or didn't want to import or whatever else reason. So I have a new UUID. It almost feels like there would need to be a change process to assign to update the understood UUID of the agency.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what that process would be. I'm sure everyone would have a different feel on how automatic or not automatic the burden, and increasing burden on state data managers or increasing burden on whatever. But I think that you're going to hit this scenario a lot more frequently than you may hit the previous one. So then having an answer here seems very important.
Uh-huh.
And I don't have one, I'm sorry.
You know, we bring the tough questions on this call.
This is Dave. When we are going to upload for a client that we just brought on, whether they were transitioning or not, there's usually a manual phase where we get our credentials from the state. And often it's image trend, but it seems to be pretty much understood that way, that exchange of user and password is manual. I think we could handle it at that stage, like Ryan said. So if you split it into two cases here, one for DEM, one for the EMS data set, it'll actually solve a different problem too, which was not having a DEM file on hand. And so if you send an EMS data set with your new UUID, is just going to get rejected because they don't have the DEM file yet, which takes care of that other case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so kind of thinking that since you're going to be in contact with the state data manager to get a user ID and password, then there's some foreknowledge that that the agency is making a software switch.
No, the project.
Right, but when they're passing on that username and password, which I totally agree with what was just said, that is typically a manual process for integrations. When they're passing on the user ID and password, would the state then pass on the UUID, or is that coming back from the new vendor? Because while the odds of it are infinitesimally small, we all know it'll happen the first time we try it. A state could hand out a UUID that might match something in the new system already and be associated to a different type of entity, because UUIDs only have to be unique inside of an agency on a single software product. So would the information flow then be the state gives the new vendor username, password, new vendor gives the state new UUID?
I think
right, that's a possibility.
Yeah, I think probably with the current ideas on the table where they're going to be, we're not mandating that the new ePCR vendor takes a UUID, then that request for the user and credentials would have to include their UUID for the agency. So we're going to submit for, County A, here's our UUID for it. Then that would have to be updated on the state side at that point, unless we're going to change those rules.
Yeah, if the rule stays that it's always generated by the collect data software, then it would have to flow that in that direction. Okay. Any other thoughts on these handling of these two scenarios here of changing the agency ID and number versus when a UUID changes for the same agency ID and number?
So from what I just heard, it sounded like we're going to be relying on the UUID quite a bit in terms of matching. So the example that I think I just heard was that if an agency ID were to match another UUID within that agency system, it could somehow confuse your agency for being a truck within your agency. So are we opening ourselves up to a situation where if something gets messed up in a system or some UUID matches, that like my personnel can become a vehicle or vice versa?
Yeah, let me I probably should have commented on that. The uniqueness aspect of a UUID is universal. So it would be an infinitesimally small chance that the same UUID would be generated for two different objects at any level.
Like
Yeah,
you're just saying.
So we're scoping the identification to be within an agency, but the uniqueness of a UUID is in fact universal.
Right, but for that scenario, I'd expect that the software is going to say, okay, I've been given this UUID. I'm going to look in the agency UUID column for a match. I'm not going to look at a vehicle column. It is infinitesimally small, but there's also a context to any query or any matching. So I would not think that it would cross over or affect the models that way.
Yeah, I agree. I wouldn't expect some kind of a collision there where an agency accidentally becomes a vehicle or something. But yeah, thanks for bringing up that question. I should have clarified that. Okay, so in a moment, we're going to do a poll to just kind of get the pulse of everyone here. We're considering these two options. If you think there's a third option, then we need to hear from you because the poll only includes these two. So option A is that, if we look back at the candidate release, we put UUID on demographic report element, the agency itself. Option A is we take it off of that element, and so we continue to identify agencies by the combination of state, agency ID, and agency number, those existing three data elements like we do today. Option B is we go ahead and we have the UUID on demographic report on that element, but we also add it to the header of the EMS data set so that if we're using the UUID to uniquely key an agency in demographics, then we can use that same UUID to identify that agency when we receive patient care report data. Again, I think that we need to do one or the other, but if there are people who think, well, we could just do part of this or leave everything like it is today in the candidate release, I definitely want to hear those viewpoints. This is what it seemed like to us as we discussed it, that to have consistency between DEM dataset and EMS dataset, we need to go one way or the other. So before we run the poll, I want to make sure that we've gotten any other further discussion out about the pros and cons. So we've talked a fair bit now about the pros and cons of having the UUID on demographic report and in the EMS dataset header, where if the agency number changes but the UUID is the same, how do we handle that? If the UUID changes but the agency number is the same, how do we handle that? We didn't talk as much about the pros and cons of having everything like they are today in NEMSIS 3.4, where we continue to identify the agency just by those data elements, agency ID number and state, with no UUID at the agency level. So pros and cons of these two approaches. What further discussion can we have? What are your further thoughts on, what's going to get us the furthest down the road in terms of our goals?
So I guess the purpose. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, go ahead. I think that might have been just some background noise from the other one.
All right, so I guess the question is the purpose of putting it into the EMS data header for matching against what we see in the demographic report? And if we're not going to be using that, are we going to continue using the same type of matching that we've been using up to this point when trying to match in the EMS data sets?
Yeah, that's right. That's what we're looking at here.
Okay, thanks for the clarity.
Mm-hmm.
Josh, this is Samantha DSM. What is the problem that we are solving here with the agency login, or agency UUID? Are we seeing that at the NEMSIS stack level we are not matching here?
I guess the problem we're trying to solve today is to resolve some ambiguity about UUID and the scope of UUID. We've scoped it to be that it identifies objects within an agency. And so we're wrestling with that scope when we actually put a UUID on the agency itself, because we're just identifying the agency itself within the agency itself. So it's that kind of that we're bumping up against the scope that we've set and trying to decide how best to solve this, that accomplishes our business purposes, which really the purposes, the business purposes are how do we identify objects over time when they change, but that's all been discussed as objects within an agency over time, not the agency itself. But we know that people do struggle with scenarios where they change agency numbers or change agency IDs and have to do some updates to make that happen.
Right, and I don't see adding the UUID at the agency level solving the problem of having to do the update, because either way, if there is a change, we want to track it every time, whether it's the UUID or the agency ID, agency license number in state as a hash, all of that will have to be updated. But my real question is the national level seeing an issue identifying agencies over time without the UUID?
Yes, they do. When agency IDs and agency numbers change, they do run into that. But at the national level, there's really no, unless the state data manager gives some advance notice, there's really no knowledge at the national level about these agencies, right? So if the national database receives data with a new agency ID and agency number, they have no way of knowing that that was actually an agency they already have and it changed agency ID or it changed agency number. But by the same token, if we add UUID and they get a data submission with a new UUID, will the national database then make an assumption that this is the same agency because we have an agency ID and agency number match, or are we going to treat that as a new agency? And so that's where the ambiguity is coming in at the national level.
Thanks.
Okay, so this is Sharon in Nebraska, and I have a question.
Yeah.
Because when our, say we have an agency that changes from a BLS service to an ALS service, and when they do that, they're assigned a new agency number because they're now an ALS service.
Okay.
Their name may stay the same. But if the option B happens and they keep the same UUID, would we be able to change that agency number when that occurs? Or because it's the same agency, but they're just changing from a BLS to an ALS service or vice versa.
Yeah, that's a great question. And you know, would this help or would it not help is what we're trying to figure out. So you would change their agency number. My guess is that you would change their agency number in your licensing system and issue a license, a new license to them. And that you may in fact go into your EMS data set either manually or through an automated linkage with licensing, and you would change the agency ID and agency number of that agency in your state system as well. Is that what you would typically do?
Well, we don't, our licensing system is not connected at all to our data reporting system for EMS. They're totally separate systems. So I don't know, I'm still just trying to think through this and how that would work if the UUID stays the same, if that could even happen.
Right. Yeah. So today, how do you do it today? When an agency changes, they become an ALS agency, they get a new license number. Do you go into your state EMS data system and manually update their license number?
I think they're just looked at as like a new agency, if I remember right.
Oh, okay. So you actually discontinue an old agency and you start up a new one. Okay. So with a UUID added, that agency continuing to use the same software product that they used before would probably continue to have the same UUID that they would be sending to your state system. You would tell them their license number changed. They would go ahead and update their license number in their local software. So when they submit data to you, you would probably have the same UUID with a new license number. And so that would be the question in your state system is, would you want your state system to see that as a new agency, even though you probably can't, because then you would have two agencies in your state system with the same UUID. And that seems like that would kind of break the intent of a UUID. And in fact, then when they submit patient care report data, if you were only using the UUID to identify the agency, all of a sudden you wouldn't know which agency to assign that patient care report to. It'd have to be the same agency that got a new license number, or you would have to get their local software to somehow create a new UUID for that agency, which is not something that would be required in the scope of the standard. You know, the standard says the UUID should never change once it has been assigned. Does that help with kind of at least, I mean, I know I'm not giving you an answer, I'm giving you all the questions though.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions that would need to be answered.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. And this is Clay. I mean, maybe the simple answer, and I think we discussed this when we went through the scenarios a little bit. The UUID would for us, for example, at the national level, would be an opportunity for us to be able to connect the data from that agency when they were BLS to the data when that agency became an ALS. So we'd be able to make that connection here and ensure that we're still reporting it as one agency over time. And I'm sure that could happen at the state level data as well, more cleanly with a UUID than without, right?
Yeah, it could perhaps help, but the state system would not be able to, like if Sharon at the state wants that to be a new agency, that's where she's going to run into problems, because she would then have two agencies with the same UUID in her state system.
Right.
So then doesn't the question become, Sharon, do you want them to be two agencies, or do you want to track them as one entity over time?
Well, that would be a question that I myself do not have the authority to answer, because there's several other people that also participate on our team. So I cannot answer that at this point.
For sure.
Hey, Josh. I know that
Yes.
here.
A quick question: is this a complex solution for kind of a problem that we kind of created ourselves? Like, would not the best answer be to use option C, leave it like it is, and not try to force agency UUIDs in the standard?
So options, I guess I should clarify. If option C is leave it like it is, then what we're talking about is the candidate release, which has added a UUID to demographic report and has not added a UUID to the EMS dataset header. But if we talk about leave it like it is being that we leave it like NEMSIS 3.4, then that would actually be option A here. It would be removing it from the demographic report, so that we would continue to use agency ID and agency number as the identifiers for an agency.
That adds clarity, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a good way to kind of restate that. Option A is to essentially take us back to like we are in 3.4 in regards to the agency itself. We would still identify it using the existing data elements that we use today. Option B says, hey, if we're going to add a UUID to the agency itself, then we should probably use that UUID in the EMS dataset header as well.
Hey, Josh, this is Juan with Florida.
Yeah.
I think option A would match more of keeping our process at the state level the same. It would have minimal impact with the state system and our processes of how we set up agencies and how we manage our agencies.
Okay.
Would another option be about the credentials that are sent to web service when you're uploading DEM and EMS files? There's that organization field, and we usually send the state license number right now, but I think we could send the UUID in there as instead. Then you would not strictly need it in either of the XML sets.
Yeah, and that organization ID, keep in mind a client may have permission to submit for multiple agencies, and I'm not sure if state systems tell that client to use, a different organization ID for each agency they're submitting for, or if that client just has a single organization ID and has permission to submit for multiple agencies. We may have implementations that go both ways.
Okay, from what we've seen by and large, it's mostly about it is validated and it is you one at a time, one agency at a time.
Okay, so you may have the same client ID and password in a particular state, but if you submit for 5 agencies, you're going to stick a different organization ID in for each of those agencies that you're submitting for.
Correct.
Okay, and then the state system is going to make sure there's a match between that and what it's seeing in the data.
Right, so it doesn't have to do any data parsing. It can reject it very quickly that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it could reject it more quickly, but it can't really accept it till it starts parsing data. But yeah, it does give it the opportunity to reject quickly. Okay, any further discussion, questions, comments, opinions?
Yeah, Josh, this is Clay. I guess this has been a great discussion. This is incredibly helpful. I look forward to the poll. I think the idea of a UUID within the agency, then it has great value. It becomes universal and it becomes unique. But the issue we're facing is that it remains unique but not universal when the data is sent to the state. So I think option B, could it just be viewed as now you have another potential variable that's coming from your agency that may or may not be universally stable over time, just like an agency ID will not remain universally the same over all time. The states could change it, but now you just have another probabilistic, weighted value to identify two records coming in from the same agency, right? So at two different times. So I guess is the real question just whether there's, at this level, is the question just whether there's additional value of having a semi-unique value to choose from to help with the process of identifying multiple records over time coming in from an agency?
Yeah, it's, I mean, we've scoped it to be within an agency. And so that's where, if we're unique within an agency, but there's, by definition, an agency is within an agency, it becomes kind of circular. Yeah, that's kind of what we're struggling with there. And yeah, I think to some extent, it's saying, hey, if we're going to implement it, then we need to use it as an identifier. And if we're not going to use it as an identifier, we probably should not implement it. And of course, then those considerations we ran through gave us scenarios where that identifier may change or other elements within the agency may change. Okay, any further discussion, or do we feel like we're sufficiently informed to take a vote? Okay, so again, we're going to do a poll, which I'll turn over to Julianne in a second. Option A is to take the agency UUID back off of demographic report. It was added in the candidate release. We would back it off. We would go back to like we are in NEMSIS 3.4 in terms of identifying the agency itself. We would rely on the combination of state, agency ID, and agency number to identify an agency. Option B is we go ahead and keep that UUID at the demographic report level, identifies an agency, agency software product combo. We use it to identify that agency over time. And since we're going to use it to identify that agency, then we add it to the EMS dataset header, which was not present in the candidate release. And we use that UUID in the EMS dataset header as a unique identifier for matching up a patient care report to the agency it belongs to in a state system. Okay, so those are the two options. So remove it from demographic report or add it to EMS dataset header. Looks like Julianne has the poll up on the screen now, so you should be able to take a moment and give us which way you're leaning. Again, if you think there's a third option, like we keep it just like it is in the candidate release, we don't make a change, we'll need to hear from you since option A and B are the only ones on the poll.
So Julianne, you'd like folks to go ahead and vote, right?
Yes, if they would vote, we're at about 56% of callers have voted. So if anybody else still wants to specify which one they would prefer, that'd be great. We'll give it just another 10 seconds or so, and I think we will have captured most everybody who wants to weigh in on this decision. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end polling. We're at 59%. 22 of you have voted. So let's That's been stable for the last 15 seconds. So I'm going to go ahead and end polling, and you should be able to see the results on your screen.
I think you might need to share your screen with us to do that. Should I stop sharing mine?
All right, let me. Share results.
Oh, there
Okay,
it is.
now, can you guys see the results?
Yeah, okay, so it looks like about 2/3 have said we remove it from a demographic report, and about 1/3 have said that we add it to the EMS dataset header. Okay, Clay, any like further discussion before we go to your last slide?
Yeah, no, this was incredibly helpful. Any other last comments that folks want to make after they've seen the results of the poll?
Just out of curiosity, do you guys take these real-time polls like lock, stock, and barrel, or do you ever consider giving people that didn't make this call a chance to vote?
Oh, for folks who didn't make the call, whether they have the opportunity to share.
Yeah, because I've never been presented with this information before a half hour ago.
Right, yeah, so that's a good comment, Dan. If this is an implementation piece where folks feel like they need additional time to talk about it, then we could probably provide that time. We always run the razor's edge of how do we decide when we truly have a consensus, and how broadly do we try to get different opinions and make sure that they're all educated and have heard the same message before making a decision. So that's always tough for us. So we try to err on the side of being able to formalize a decision and move forward. But if you think there's other kind of aspects or other technical kind of aspects of this question that need further discussion, or if you need to go back to your group and further describe, we can decide to do that as well at this point.
Clay, this is Laurel. Can I speak to the timing a little bit?
Oh yeah, please.
So Dan and others, we don't normally put decisions out with this little time for people to decide. I think this is the first time we've done a live poll like this on one of the implementation calls. But in this case, we are under a bit of a timing constraint. In order to meet the stated timeline for all of the deliverables, we really do need to finalize the XSD this week, have all the changes committed in to get this week. And part of that included solving this sort of last remaining UUID issue. And while I would love to hear any comments, I do sort of feel a time crunch to have a decision made so I can ensure that it's implemented by the time the week is over, so we have time to develop schematron and test cases and all of the other items that are going to go with the release. We did discuss UUID at length in the annual meeting, and I do believe this issue in particular was sort of a part of that discussion, or it came out of that discussion, because when we decided to present this on the call today, we did so after looking over our set of notes from the report out sections from the annual meeting. So I would welcome any feedback, but would stress that I really do need it today so that we can do a quick turnaround here from the candidate release to the final release of the 3.5 standard.
Yes, so Dan, are you feeling some apprehension with some aspect of the discussion? Laurel stated that very well, right? There's lots of work behind us, and we have these few little things to kind of clean up. Is there a need for us, for example, to hold another call later today with other folks that you think might benefit from having their opinions, or some other approach? You may be on mute, Dan.
Hope we didn't lose Dan.
Yeah.
Okay, can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Yep,
geez.
yep.
All right. Okay, so I think I've been muted for a while, but no, I don't think we need another call. But perhaps, you know, Josh put together a pretty nice presentation, and if we could have even seen this yesterday, we could have had more time to discuss this internally. Maybe the next time we have a vote, that might be one idea. That's all.
Yeah, that's a good idea, Dan. We could certainly do that. We worked hard to have this slide set together. It was ready at the beginning of the week, so we certainly could have set it out. That would have been a smart thing to do, particularly if there's going to be a poll. So we'll take that into account if we're going to ask for an opinion on an issue that we formally present. We'll do that. That's a really good idea.
Yeah, and then I don't know if it'd be helpful to send this out, you know, as a follow-up to this call. Obviously, feedback would be needed quickly, but yeah.
How about sending out the PowerPoint and the meeting notes from today, like ASAP, and see whether to the Google groups and see whether anybody wants to respond.
Certainly, yeah, we could certainly post this to the Google group. I'll make a note of that.
This is Laurel again. I think we also would have the ability to be able to take a longer running poll via the Google group. We could do some sort of survey. So if you guys wanted to vote again, we could make that possible by sending a link out to the group, I think. But again, pretty quick turnaround on this one.
Okay, any other last comments related to this discussion?
I really appreciate the discussion we've had today, the input, the thoughts, and I know you'll probably be kind of mulling it over now that we've brought up these scenarios. It's been one that we've certainly struggled with as we've prepared for the final release, and really appreciate the opportunity to present these options and get all of your thoughts from your expertise.
All right, this is Clay. We just wanted to cover one more slide associated with this discussion to kind of wrap up all of the items that were posted as discussion items in Deer Valley 3 weeks ago. The other aspects of the discussion related to UUID really revolved around the idea of providing better kind of educational information regarding the use and the scope of UUID. So the other issues that we will be following up with over the next couple of months in regards to responding to the discussions that were held in Deer Valley, we committed at the NEMSIS TAC to document kind of the business value and use case for UUID. That is that its value is within the agency, within a software, helping state officials to understand why it was added and what it will help with. The other item that we were asked to further work on was to provide some type of a documentation that could indicate methods that could be implemented for future discussion among this group and other stakeholders as to how we might be able to come up with a systematic way to maintain an agency identification within a receive and process system, even when an agency was to switch software. So we've discussed a number of those approaches on this call today. Others have been brought up here just at the TAC, and others were discussed at at Deer Valley. So there's some ideas for us to again take the value of the UUID to kind of another level to provide some further clarity and consistency in regards to the data flowing to the state. So we'll attempt to document those approaches, and that will be something that I think in the future we'll try to solidify across the country an approach to make that happen. And then was just going to reiterate the point. Another item that received a bunch of discussion up at Deer Valley was that, and the final decision was made that initially there'll be no testing of collect data systems for import of a UUID during the compliance testing process. So I'll pause there for a moment and see if there are any questions about those items. For those who attended the meeting in Deer Valley 3 weeks ago, were there any other items associated with the discussions regarding UUID, either in your breakout sessions or in the session that we had together that you feel was important but was not represented by Josh or by this slide? Okay. All right, great. Well, very valuable discussion. Thank you. This has been incredibly helpful. We will post this. We'll speak with Laurel perhaps about providing some way for you to respond back after it's been posted to Google Group if there's some discussion we want to have. That's the entire purpose of Google Group. So there's would be a great opportunity for us to use it as a discussion site if we wish to regarding this issue. So we'll work on that right after the call. All right, Julianne, I'll turn the call back over to you for our last item.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Josh, and thank you, Clay. The next item on the agenda is the 2018 Public Research Dataset release. The 2018 Public Data Research is available and complete. There are two ways to access it on the website. I think I've got you all up on the, let's make sure. Can everybody see the main NEMSIS website? Is that what you're looking at?
Yes.
Okay, good. Sometimes it's hard to know when you've got multiple screens. So from the main NEMSIS website, you can either go on the researchers box down here or using EMS data and go to request research data. Here you can see the notice for the data set that's available. It includes more than 22 million EMS activations submitted by 9,599 agencies in 39 states and territories. It is a tremendous data set. So for the 2018, this is how you would access requesting that data set from this page. And about halfway down, there's a request form here that you need to fill out and return for the 2018 Public Release Research Dataset on a thumb drive. And that will be encrypted, and you'll receive a notice of how to open that. So we just want to make sure everybody's aware of that availability. Any questions on the 2018 Public Release Research Dataset? All right. The next thing on the agenda, was there anything from the Office of EMS NHTSA?
Hey, Julianne, I know that they had an office-wide meeting today. I just received a message from Eric indicating that they wouldn't be able to make the call.
Okay. No problem on that. Let's go ahead. Let me put it back over to the agenda. Are there any open forum discussions that anybody would like to bring to this group at this time?
Hey, Julianne, this is Juan. with Florida.
Hi, Juan.
How are you guys doing? There's some stuff with the 3.5 candidate release that we never talked about. Now that I hear that we're getting ready to close it out, the XSE, there's some structure stuff for the new state data set that we added that I was hoping we would look at before you close out the XSE.
Do you know in particular which question? I know we've been working through the requests that we received from many submissions. One of them was yours. We received quite a bit of input from you, and that was fabulous, very helpful. Can you think of which issue in particular for the state data set?
The S configuration section.
All right, so if we've got Clay or Laurel still on the line, do either of you want to speak to that?
Yeah, Juan, we actually just finished going through your comments just last week. Laurel, do you remember the comment about S configuration? Laurel may have had to jump off. Are you still on the call, Laurel?
I think she had to go to that other meeting.
Yeah, Juan, that's a good thought. Let us do a little bit of investigation there, and we will organize another call if there's a piece there that we weren't able to come to a decision on. But we'll contact you either way. Juan, all of the decisions are in the JIRA public website. So if you went there from the website, do you have? Looks like you have control, Julianne. Can you go to the NEMSIS website? Let's just briefly show how you can access the decisions. So we're still seeing the agenda for today.
There we go. So just from the main site, view the candidate release, and how can I follow along? Here's the public JIRA. These are all of the issues that have been submitted and resolved or tabled, and then the comment form.
Yeah, click on the public JIRA project if you would. And then we'll, I'm just looking real quickly in the backlog to see if any of the items related to Juan's comments are still there. I think they're.
Yeah, I think it's the one at the top there. Simplify the state data set.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so that still sits in backlog. Yeah, so Juan, if that's one that we need to take a hard look at, then we will do that. Do you have time today? The fact that it's still in backlog makes me wonder why it's there. If you feel like it should have moved on. This is kind of a parking lot now, mostly for things that we just will not be doing with 3.5. But we may not have completely understood your question. So can I call you today and just revisit that and make sure that we understand it? If it's an issue that we need to jump on before we finish the candidate release, and we'll hold another call.
Okay, yeah, definitely. You can call me anytime.
Okay, Juan, thank you.
Thank you, Juan, for bringing that up. Are there any other issues that anyone wants to bring up during an open forum? Okay, so our next meeting, our next call will be September 25th. On your screens now, you should be able to see the public training calendar. We've got software compliance training coming up on October 1st. This month, we did an overview of changes to V3.5.0, and we had a great turnout, lots of good questions. we're able to spend some time with Clay and Laurel and Josh, really digging into some of those changes. So for those of you who are interested in the process for software vendors to qualify for and maintain NEMSIS compliance, we'll have an opportunity to talk with Laurel on October 1st for that. The next call will be September 25th, same time, same place. Thank you all for being here. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules and for
Was that call recorded?
What? Yes, it is.
Okay, and that's on the YouTube channel?
It is.
All right.
It was really good too. I think you'll enjoy that. And October should be great as well. Any questions, comments, concerns before we end this call?
Julianne, this is Samantha. Do we need to register for that webinar, or is it just show up?
You do not need to register. You can just show up. You can use the QR code to add it to your calendar. The connection information is available on the flyer. There is no need to register. Just come, participate in the conversation, have your questions ready. If you know you've got specific issues that you want addressed, send them to me or to Laurel ahead of time, and we'll make sure that those get tackled during that session. We're intending the public training sessions to last 30 minutes to an hour. They shouldn't go over an hour. So it's just going to be a great opportunity to learn and to ask questions that are specific to what you guys are concerned about.
Julianne, this is Clay. Could you also post this flyer just one more time to the Google group? Just so
I sure will.
Okay, great.
All right, if there's nothing else, I think we're done for the day. Thank you all for being here, and have a fabulous rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.